Hey guys, tonight we're talking about what it was really like to spend a day in a medieval dungeon. The suffocating stench, the ankle-deep filth, the rats that treat your sleeping body as an obstacle course, and the kind of food that could technically be called bread, only if you ignored the worms. If you're enjoying our sleepy history journeys, I'd really appreciate a quick like or a subscribe. And hey, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing our sleepy community grow across the world. Now close your eyes, lay back. Because tonight, you're not just watching history, you're living it. The first thing that hits you is the smell. It's not the kind of bad smell you can get used to. It's the kind that seeps into your hair, your clothes, your soul. Centuries before anyone understood germs, medieval prisons operated on the philosophy that if you were unlucky enough to end up inside, you didn't deserve fresh air. Cells were often underground, tucked into castle basements or carved into damp stone, with one small opening high above the wall for air, usually blocked by an iron grate so corroded it could give you tetanus just from looking at it. And about that air, it's heavy, almost sticky, with the combined aromas of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, mould, and human waste. Historical records from the 14th century note that jailers often let prisoners stew in their own filth for weeks before even thinking about cleaning the cell. Cleaning usually meant tossing in a bucket of water, which only turned the dirt floor into a swampy mess. You don't get your own space here. Dungeons were rarely the solitary chambers you might imagine. That was an expensive luxury. More often, you'd be crammed into a single dark room with anywhere from a handful to dozens of other unfortunate souls, shackled to the wall or floor with iron chains that rubbed your ankles raw. The iron wasn't smooth either. It was rough, cold, and often rusted. You could count on sores, infections, and a delightful variety of medieval skin diseases within a few days. And you're hungry. In medieval Europe, prison food was not designed to keep you healthy. It was designed to keep you alive, just enough to serve your sentence or pay your ransom. Historical accounts mention something called prison bread, a dense, dark loaf often made from the cheapest grains, and sometimes bulked out with sawdust or ground-up bean husks. This bread was so hard it had to be soaked in water or ale to be chewable, and it often arrived crawling with weevils. As for water, you might get some if you could stomach the brown, brackish liquid that came from the nearest river or well. In some prisons, beer or weak ale was actually safer to drink than water, though it carried its own charming aftertaste of mouldy barrels. By now, the rats have found you. Medieval chroniclers describe prison rats as bold, fat, and entirely unbothered by human presence. They thrived on the scraps and corpses left behind in the cells, and they were known to gnaw on the feet or hands of prisoners who were too weak to swat them away. You learn quickly that the sound of scurrying in the straw is never a good sign. The noise here is its own kind of torture. Chains clank, people cough, deep, wet coughs that never seem to end, and somewhere, water drips steadily into a puddle. Sometimes there's screaming, especially if someone is being questioned in another room. Torture chambers were often just down the hall, and their sounds bled into the prison like an unwanted soundtrack. The most infamous devices, the rack, the thumbscrew, the iron boot, were more often used for intimidation than for daily punishment, but knowing they were there was enough to keep most people terrified. The diseases here make the filth seem polite. Without sanitation, lice and fleas were constant companions, spreading typhus, trench fever, and worse. Wounds rarely healed. Instead, they festered in the damp, unventilated air. Physicians of the time might have recommended bleeding you to balance your humours, which was a medieval way of saying let's drain some blood and hope for the best. In reality, the only thing being balanced was the jailer's budget, by not wasting valuable medicine on prisoners. And yet, it's not just the physical misery that gets you, it's the politics. In many medieval towns, prisons weren't run by the crown, but by local lords, bishops, or even private contractors. This meant that how you were treated often depended on how much you, or your family, could pay. There were recorded cases in which wealthy prisoners rented better rooms, bought their own food, and even hired servants while technically imprisoned. The poor, meanwhile, were left in the communal pit. Bribes could buy you lighter chains, a corner to yourself, or a blanket that hadn't already been used as both bedding and a latrine. Time loses meaning here. Without sunlight, you can't tell if it's day or night. The only clues are the occasional footsteps of the jailer, the distant ringing of a bell in the world above, and the changing temperature of the stones around you. Some prisoners mark time by scratching tallies into the wall, others by counting the days until their bread ran out. For many, the dungeon wasn't a temporary punishment. It was a slow, suffocating sentence that ended only when you were ransomed, executed, or simply forgotten. And as you try to sleep, curling up on damp straw, trying to avoid the sharpest bits of stone beneath you, you realise there's no escaping the sounds, smells, and scraping chains. This isn't the kind of place you survive through willpower alone. It's the kind of place that strips you down to the basics of existence: breathing, waiting, and hoping your turn for the questioning room never comes. But even here, there's more to tell. Because life in a medieval dungeon wasn't just about the cold stone and the hunger. It was also about the strange little ecosystem that formed inside these walls, from the secret economies to the bizarre methods people used to pass the endless hours. And that's where our journey continues. You start to notice that the dungeon has its own rules. Not written anywhere, of course. Written things are for the people upstairs who have candles and dry paper. Here everything is carved in glances, traded in whispers, and cemented with whatever counts as currency, in a place where money is nearly useless. Coins do have some value here, but not in the way you might think. Unless you can pay a guard directly to look the other way, a shiny silver penny is just a flat piece of metal that can be stolen, swallowed, or pried from your cold fingers when you stop breathing. Real value comes in the form of things you can use right now. Food scraps, a bit of cloth, a half-decent piece of straw that does not smell like something has died in it. In some dungeons, bits of bread were shaved down and dried to make crude tokens for barter, which were then exchanged for favours. These favours might include holding your bucket of waste for a few minutes so you could stretch your legs, or keeping watch while you try to pry a flea colony from your skin. There are records from the 14th century London showing that wealthy prisoners could rent their own chains. That sounds absurd until you realise that the standard issue ones were designed for maximum discomfort, with jagged edges that bit into the skin. A rented chain might at least be smooth, allowing you to keep some skin on your ankles. That same system extended to bedding. Pay the jailer and you could replace the communal straw mat with your own pile of hay, or even a worn blanket. This was less about comfort and more about survival, since the shared bedding was a breeding ground for lice and scabies. The jailer is the true king here. Officially, his job is to keep you contained until your trial, ransom, or execution. Unofficially, he is the merchant, judge, and tax collector of your miserable little world. Historical accounts suggest that jailers often received little or no wage from the crown, relying instead on fees collected from the prisoners themselves. You paid for everything, from the food you ate to the water you drank. In some places, there was even a charge for unlocking your shackles each morning. Fail to pay, and you stayed locked up until someone else took pity on you, or until infection set in. A 13th century French manuscript describes a dungeon where a prisoner could pay for light by renting a candle. One candle might cost the equivalent of several days' worth of food, but it allowed you to see the rats before they reached you. The same source mentions that prisoners often formed alliances to share the cost of these luxuries. If you had nothing to trade, you could still gain protection by offering a service. Sharpening bones into makeshift tools, weaving rope from strips of clothing, or even singing to drown out the sounds from the torture chamber down the hall, could all earn you a stale crust of bread. The barter system is not without its hazards. Once you have something valuable, you have to defend it. Theft in a dungeon is a curious thing because it is rarely punished by the authorities. From the guards' perspective, you are all criminals anyway, so the loss of your stale loaf or piece of bent wire is just part of the natural order. This means that prisoners develop their own enforcement methods. These range from the subtle, hiding your goods inside hollowed chunks of bread, to the brutal, which in cramped conditions usually means using your chains as a weapon. There's also an entire trade in information. News from the outside world is rare and precious, so a guard's drunken comment or the muffled sound of church bells above can be sold for food. Knowledge of when the bailiff is visiting, when the next trial is scheduled, or whether a high-ranking prisoner is about to be transferred can shift the balance of power inside the walls. Medieval chroniclers note that in some dungeons, the most respected inmates were not the strongest, but the ones who knew how to listen and remember. Food itself becomes a kind of coin. Leftover gruel is stored in wooden bowls, or, if you do not have one, in whatever container you can scavenge. This gruel is a masterpiece of medieval efficiency, meaning it contains whatever scraps the cook can find that day. It might be barley, peas, and a little salted meat, or it might be nothing but boiled weeds and water thickened with flour. Even so, a spoonful can be traded for a dozen different things, from a shift in sleeping position to a few minutes in a warmer corner near the torches. The guards know this economy exists and often exploit it. They will confiscate a prisoner's food and resell it to someone else. They will promise extra water in exchange for silence about a beating. In one infamous 15th century German prison, guards reportedly set up games of dice using pebbles as markers, encouraging prisoners to gamble away what little they had. The winners, of course, had to pay the guards for permission to keep their winnings. Hygiene items, if you can even call them that, are another part of this microeconomy. A rag soaked in vinegar might serve as a crude disinfectant and fetch a high price from someone with an open wound. Pieces of charcoal from the cooking fire can be traded for their ability to mask odours or be ground into makeshift ink for secret messages. Even the bones of rats or scraps of leather from broken shoes can be shaped into tools, weapons, or crude utensils. The more time you spend here, the more you realise that the dungeon runs on a strange mixture of desperation and ingenuity. Nothing is wasted because everything is worth something to someone. A bucket of stale water might be worth nothing to you, but everything to the prisoner who needs to rinse infection from a wound. A handful of lice picked from your own hair could be a bet in a gambling match. And this hidden economy shapes life here just as much as the chains and the stone walls. It decides who eats and who starves, who has allies, and who is left to fend for themselves. It can even determine who lives long enough to see the outside world again. But there is another force at work in the dungeon that is just as important as food or coin. It is the constant battle against the damp, the cold, and the slow rot that seeps into your bones. And that is a fight you cannot bargain your way out of. You notice it first in your hands. The skin feels tight, almost brittle, as though it has been stretched too thin over bone. Your breath fogs the air, and each exhale hangs for a moment before melting into the dampness that saturates every surface. The dungeon is not just cold. It is a slow-moving glacier that has decided to take up residence inside your body. These stone walls do not radiate warmth. They pull it from you. Limestone and granite are excellent at storing cold, and here in the bowels of the building they have been collecting it for centuries. The floor is the same, always wet, sometimes with seepage from the river outside, sometimes with less pleasant contributions from inside. The concept of dry does not exist down here. Medieval builders didn't bother with waterproofing in the way we think of it now. Mortar cracked, water leaked, and the air grew thick with moisture that never left. In winter, the temperature could drop so low that water froze in the cracks of the walls. Historical accounts tell of prisoners who awoke with their hair literally frozen to the stone where they slept. Breaking free meant losing clumps of hair and sometimes skin. In warmer months, the damp simply changed tactics. Instead of freezing you, it encouraged mold to bloom in vibrant shades of green, black and white across the walls. The spores hung in the air, invisible but relentless, creeping into lungs already weakened by the lack of fresh air. Your clothing, if you have any, is never truly dry. Medieval fabric was thick and coarse, usually wool, which holds water like a sponge. Once damp, it stays damp, wicking heat away from your skin and leaving you shivering even when the air is still. In many prisons, clothing was not replaced regularly, meaning the same tunic might serve you for years, growing steadily heavier as it absorbed sweat, filth, and the general humidity of the dungeon. Cold does more than make you uncomfortable. It changes the way your body works. Without enough food to generate heat, your metabolism slows, muscles ache, and joints stiffen. Accounts from the 15th century describe prisoners hobbling like the elderly after only a few months in confinement, their bodies prematurely aged by the unrelenting chill. Infection thrives in such conditions. A small cut, aggravated by the metal of your shackles, can become a deep abscess when your body is too cold to fight it off. And then there is the sound. The cold makes the stone contract, causing tiny creaks and pops that seem to echo forever. Drops of water plink into puddles at irregular intervals, a sound that becomes so constant you only notice when it stops. On those rare days when the outside world warms enough to send a trickle of sunlight through the high, barred opening, the dungeon reacts not with warmth, but with a fresh wave of condensation, as the cold stone sweats under the sudden change. To medieval jailers, this was not a problem to solve. A cold, wet dungeon was not considered a flaw in the design, it was a feature. The discomfort served as its own form of punishment. Records from English Crown prisons note that repairs to leaking walls were rarely approved unless the structure was in danger of collapse. The suffering of the prisoners was not only expected, it was often seen as beneficial for moral correction. The damp does something else to you too. It erases the distinction between seasons. In summer you expect relief but find none. In winter you expect misery and get exactly that. The stone walls offer no hint of a breeze, no moment of dryness. You live in an endless cycle of shiver, ache, and fatigue. The thin straw on the floor soaks up water like a sponge, creating a mattress that is equal parts bedding and swamp. Some prisoners attempted to build small raised platforms from scavenged wood or stacked stones, but the guards often dismantled them to keep things orderly. Disease finds fertile ground in this climate. Rheumatism, bronchitis, and pneumonia were common causes of death behind bars. The medical understanding of the time attributed these illnesses to bad air or imbalanced humours, which is not entirely wrong given the mould spores and stagnant atmosphere. Treatment, however, rarely went beyond bleeding you, prescribing a foul-smelling herbal poultice, or advising you to pray harder. Even without illness, the sheer mental wear of living in such an environment can strip you down. The constant damp becomes part of your identity. You smell of mildew. Your hair feels like wet rope. Your skin takes on a pale, waxy hue from lack of sunlight. You forget what it is like to feel truly warm unless you can remember the heat of a fire from your life before the cell. And as weeks blend into months, your mind begins to treat the cold not as an intruder but as a constant companion. The dungeon does not just hold you. It consumes you slowly, cell by cell, until you belong to it. The cold and damp are not obstacles you overcome. They are the climate you adapt to. Some prisoners tried to fight it with movement, pacing in their chains until exhaustion forced them to collapse. Others huddled together for warmth, though this was a dangerous gamble in a place where disease moved faster than light. And yet, as bad as the cold and damp are, there is another constant presence in the dungeon that works just as efficiently to break you. It is smaller, faster, and far more numerous than you could ever imagine. They do not wait for you to notice them. They already know you are here. The rats move with the confidence of creatures who have ruled this place for generations. You hear them first in the dark, the rapid patter of tiny claws skittering across stone, the faint rustle of straw that should be still. Then comes the smell, a musky tang layered over the already overwhelming perfume of mould and waste. In the dungeon, rats are not pests, they are residents. You are the intruder. Medieval records are not shy about their presence. Chroniclers in both England and France noted that rats in prisons grew larger than those in the surrounding towns, fattened on a steady diet of grain scraps, spoiled bread, and the occasional prisoner who had lost the ability to swat them away. They were bold, biting at exposed fingers or toes while you slept. Some were known to chew through clothing to get at crumbs. There are accounts of prisoners waking to find rat nests built in the folds of their own tattered blankets. The fleas arrive with the rats, though they also travel in on your fellow inmates. In a place where washing is rare and bedding is shared, fleas thrive in numbers that seem impossible. These are not minor irritations. Medieval fleas were efficient disease vectors, capable of carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of the plague, as well as typhus. In close, damp quarters, a single flea bite could turn into an outbreak that killed more prisoners than any execution order. Lice are the ever-present middlemen in this chain of misery. Unlike fleas, they do not leap. They simply settle in and make a life on your skin. They feed daily, leaving behind itchy welts that never have time to heal before the next feeding. Medieval medical texts often blamed lice on an excess of heat and moisture in the blood, which is a poetic way of saying that you are dirty, sweaty, and trapped in a place where washing is as rare as kindness. The prescribed remedies included bathing in vinegar or applying crushed herbs, neither of which you're likely to receive here unless you can bribe a guard. You scratch constantly, but relief is temporary. The itching becomes part of your daily existence, a background noise in your nervous system. You might pick off a flea and crush it between your nails, but for every one you kill, a dozen more are already somewhere on your body. The prisoners who manage to keep infestations at bay are usually the ones who can pay for cleaner straw or the occasional bucket of hot water. For everyone else, the fight is endless. Rats are more than just scavengers, they are part of the dungeon's black market economy. A live rat can be used to frighten a weaker prisoner into giving up food. Rat skins, once scraped and dried, can be fashioned into crude pouches or bindings. Some prisoners even attempted to trap and eat them during lean times. Historical accounts vary on how common this was, but given the lack of better options, it is not hard to imagine. The guards have their own relationship with the vermin. Some actively encourage cats in the dungeon to control the rat population, though the cats themselves become half wild from living in the dark. Others see the rats as a natural form of punishment, the crawling and biting an extra layer of suffering that costs nothing to maintain. In some darker tales, rats were even used deliberately in interrogation, though these stories are as much about spreading fear as they are about recorded fact. Your sleeping arrangements only make matters worse. Straw bedding is the perfect home for fleas and lice. The straw is rarely changed, and when it is often replaced with another equally infested pile taken from elsewhere. In some cells, the straw is so thick with flea dirt, the black specks of dried blood excreted by the insects, that it crunches underfoot. Lice eggs cling to every fibre, waiting to hatch. Even if you manage to remove every parasite from your body, lying down again would undo the work in minutes. The mental toll of this constant invasion is enormous. You never get a moment of stillness. Even when your chains keep you from moving, something else is always moving on you. It changes the way you sleep, the way you think, the way you value your own body. You start to measure time not in hours or days, but in the length of an itch, the interval between one bite and the next. There is no true solution here, only temporary victories. The vermin are as much a part of the dungeon as the stones and the guards. They are survivors in their own right, thriving in an environment where everything else seems to wither. You begin to wonder if, long after you're gone, the rats and fleas will still be here, scurrying and biting in the dark, waiting for the next unlucky human to arrive. And as you scratch at a new bite, you realise that the infestation is only part of the problem. The dungeon's very air works against you, thick with smells that cling to your skin and refuse to leave. It is not the kind of smell you encounter in the outside world. This is not the sourness of a spoiled meal or the sharpness of a barnyard. This is a layered odour built over centuries, seeping into every stone and fibre until the dungeon itself smells alive. The moment you breathe it in, it coats the inside of your nose and stays there. You can close your mouth, hold your breath, turn your head. It does not matter. The stench is part of the air itself. Human waste is the foundation of it. In many medieval prisons there were no proper latrines. Prisoners relieved themselves where they sat or stood, the waste pooling on the floor or soaking into the straw. In some dungeons a bucket was provided, but it was emptied only when someone remembered, which could be days or weeks. The smell of urine and feces never truly left, instead mixing into a permanent bass note that clung to everything you touched. Chroniclers from the 14th century noted that some visitors refused to enter certain prison chambers at all, claiming the air itself could make you ill. But that is only the beginning. There is the rank scent of bodies that have not been washed in months, sometimes years. Skin produces oils, sweat and bacteria in a constant cycle, and without any way to bathe, these layers build up until a person carries their own unique aura of rot and salt. Add to that the smell of infected wounds, sour, metallic and faintly sweet in the way only decay can be, and the air becomes a medical record you can smell without seeing. The damp walls add their own flavour. Mould and mildew bloom freely here, fed by the constant humidity. Some moulds release an earthy smell, almost like wet soil after rain, but sharper and more aggressive. Others produce a musty odour so strong it feels solid, as if you could chew it. Medieval physicians sometimes referred to the air in such places as miasma, a poisonous vapour thought to cause illness. They were not entirely wrong. Mould spores, ammonia from waste and bacteria from rotting organic matter can indeed make you sick. Rotting food adds yet another layer. The bread you're given might be stale when it arrives, but in this climate it quickly crosses over into mouldy. Gruel, left too long, ferments into a sharp sourness that mingles with the smell of whatever animal fat was boiled into it. In some cases, scraps left behind were not cleaned away but simply mashed into the floor with footsteps, creating a thin paste that gave off a permanent tang of decay. Dead things contribute too. Rats die here. So do people. Bodies might be removed eventually, but not before the air has already absorbed their passing. Historical accounts from certain German dungeons in the 15th century describe corpses being left in cells for days due to disputes over burial fees. The smell of decomposition in an enclosed, damp environment is not something you forget. It clings to your skin, your hair, even your teeth. The stench has no mercy. It is democratic in its reach. Guards smell it as much as prisoners do, though they have the advantage of leaving at the end of their shift. Visitors often gag upon entering, holding herbs or vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces in a medieval attempt at a gas mask. Prisoners have no such defence. Over time, your brain tries to dull the smell, but it never fully disappears. Instead, it becomes part of your sense of reality, a constant reminder that you are somewhere no one is meant to live. In some prisons, the smell was even considered part of the punishment. A foul dungeon was believed to weaken the spirit, breaking a prisoner's will to resist. There are records of political prisoners being moved from relatively clean cells to the foulest pits specifically to demoralize them. The smell worked in tandem with the cold, the darkness, and the chains to erode the human mind as efficiently as any torture device. You try to adapt, breathing shallowly, turning your head toward the faintest whiff of fresher air near the barred opening. But there is no true escape. Every breath tastes of centuries of misery. It is in the water you drink, the straw you sleep on, the clothes you wear. Even if you left tomorrow, it would travel with you in your hair and your pores, a souvenir no one wants. And just when you think you have catalogued every scent, a new one arrives, sharper, stranger, and even harder to ignore. It is the smell of fire and iron, drifting in from the chamber next door, where the tools of medieval persuasion are kept ready. The smell reaches you before the sight. Heated metal has a scent, faint at first, then metallic and sharp as it warms. In a dungeon, that smell rarely means cooking. It means someone is preparing an instrument of persuasion, the polite medieval term for devices designed to turn stubborn silence into hurried confession. You may never see the room where they are kept, but you hear it, smell it, and feel it in the way the air changes. This chamber is often just a short walk, or drag, from the cells. It is not for daily punishment. It is for moments when the authorities want answers quickly, or when an example needs to be made. The devices themselves are products of medieval engineering, built to be durable, terrifying, and multifunctional. The rack is the most famous. A simple frame, rollers at each end, and ropes designed to pull the human body in opposite directions. It is not used casually. The cost of building one, and the labour to operate it, meant it was reserved for cases where the stakes were considered high. Chroniclers describe its creak as the ropes tightened, a sound that travelled down stone corridors like an echo from a nightmare. Then there are the smaller tools, ones that can be carried and stored without ceremony. The thumbscrew, for instance. 2 metal plates tightened by a screw to crush the digits slowly. Easy to hide, easy to use, and effective without leaving much visible damage if the user preferred to keep the victim alive. There were also variants for toes, knuckles, and even knees. Archaeological finds from European castles have turned up such devices, their simple construction a reminder that pain did not require complex design. Iron boots were another favourite, especially in colder regions. They encased the feet and lower legs in metal, which could then be tightened, filled with wedges, or even heated. Records from the Scottish borders mention prisoners left in them for days, the boots doubling as shackles and punishment. The smell of burned leather, or sometimes burned flesh, would drift through the halls long after the boots were removed. Not all persuasion relied on heat or crushing. Some devices were about confinement within confinement. Iron collars with spikes turned the act of sitting or sleeping into agony. Wooden stocks forced the body into awkward positions for hours, stretching muscles and cutting off circulation. The medieval mind understood that pain could be as much about exhaustion as about injury. This room also hosted more improvisational methods. Ropes, pulleys, and simple winches could be combined in endless ways. The strappado, for example, involved binding a person's hands behind their back, attaching them to a rope, and suspending them until shoulders dislocated. It required no special equipment beyond what was already on hand in most castles. It also required a high ceiling, which is why some dungeons have strangely tall chambers with beams across the top. The guards and executioners who operated these tools were not amateurs. In many places they were trained specialists, sometimes even paid better than ordinary soldiers. They knew how far to go without killing a person, how to keep them conscious long enough to talk, and how to use the mere sight of an unused device to make someone reconsider their silence. Manuals from the late Middle Ages included instructions for questioning, outlining a mix of verbal intimidation and physical demonstration before any actual pain was inflicted. For the prisoners still in their cells, the sounds from that room carried their own weight. A faint groan, the creak of wood under strain, the sudden clatter of a dropped tool. The silence afterward could be worse than the noise. It left you wondering whether the person had fainted, died, or simply decided to talk. The uncertainty was part of the system's power. Torture was not as constant as popular imagination suggests. It was expensive in time, energy, and equipment maintenance. But its shadow loomed large, making even the hint of being summoned to that room a form of control. In some prisons, the mere act of walking a prisoner past the door was enough to convince them to cooperate. Others would be forced to watch as someone else endured it. The lesson meant for them as much as the victim. When the work was done, the room would be cleaned in the loosest sense of the word. Ashes from burned items might be swept away. Buckets of water might be thrown on the floor. The air, however, could not be scrubbed. It lingered in the corridors, a reminder to everyone of what waited behind that door. And yet, for all its menace, this was only one part of the dungeon's arsenal. For those not deemed worthy of formal questioning, there were other punishments, cruder, cheaper, and in some ways even harder to endure over the long haul. The dungeon does not need the spectacle of the rack or the iron boots to wear you down. Those are for special occasions, for making examples or prying open the mouths of the uncooperative. The real work of breaking you happens in smaller, quieter ways, punishments that cost almost nothing to inflict and can be repeated for as long as necessary. One of the simplest is the short ration. Food is already scarce, but the jailer can cut it further without explanation. In some medieval prisons, official regulations allowed for bread to be withheld entirely for a day or two as punishment for disobedience. Water could be limited as well, leaving you to choose between thirst and the risk of drinking from the slimy puddles on the floor. Chroniclers note that withholding food was often more effective than outright beatings, because hunger dulls thought and leaves you too weak to resist in other ways. There is also the chaining. Chains are not merely restraints here, they are tools of discomfort. A guard might tighten the iron rings around your ankles or wrists until the circulation slows, causing swelling and numbness. Medieval jailers sometimes added extra links to force you into awkward positions, keeping your arms above your head or twisting your legs. A 14th century prison account from France describes prisoners shackled so closely to the wall that they could not lie down fully, forced to sleep sitting against cold stone. Dark confinement is another favourite. Even in a place already starved of light, you can be moved into a smaller, deeper cell with no opening at all. These were known in some regions as oubliettes, from the French word for to forget. They were not always deep pits as legends suggest, but they were places where you could be left alone for days, with no sound but your own breathing and no way to measure time. In some English castles, these cells were so narrow you could not stretch your arms, the idea being that physical discomfort would blend with the mental strain of total isolation. Then there is the simple cruelty of exposure. In winter, a prisoner might be stripped of clothing for a night, left to shiver on the damp floor. In summer, they might be left in a sunlit courtyard, chained so they could not move to shade, though this was more common in above-ground holding areas. The dungeon version often involved placing you closer to the coldest point in the cell, or near a constant draft from an open grate. It was not enough to kill quickly, but enough to make every breath an effort. Some punishments are almost petty in their design. Removing your bedding, for instance, is not fatal, but in a place where comfort is already a memory, losing even a filthy pile of straw can push you toward despair. Taking away a cup or bowl forces you to drink from your hands or lap at water spilled on the ground. Cutting your hair to the scalp may seem harmless, but in the cold, it strips away one of the few layers of insulation your body still has. The guards could also manipulate the dungeon's own ecosystem to your disadvantage. In some accounts, prisoners who angered the staff were moved into the worst corner of the cell, the one closest to the waste bucket or the seepage from the wall. You might find yourself lying in a patch of ground permanently wet from a leak in the masonry. Rats would be bolder there, fleas more numerous. The air somehow would be thicker and harder to breathe. Noise, too, could be used as a weapon. Medieval prisons were rarely silent, but guards could make them worse. Slamming iron gates in the middle of the night, dragging chains along the floor, banging on the walls without warning. Sleep deprivation was as effective then as it is now, eroding your body's ability to recover and clouding your mind with confusion. None of these punishments require special equipment or elaborate preparation. They're born of the fact that in the dungeon, your survival depends entirely on the whims of those in control. A bored guard can make your life worse in seconds and better in none. That constant uncertainty is itself a punishment, keeping you on edge even when nothing is happening. And yet all of this unfolds under the same dim, flickering light. The dungeon's lighting, or lack of it, shapes everything you see and feel here. Without it, time itself begins to fray, and you start to lose the sense of where you end and the darkness begins. Light is not something you think about much in the outside world. You wake with it, work in it, eat by it, and let it fade as the sun sets. Down here it becomes a rare event, a visitor you might glimpse only briefly and then miss for weeks. In the dungeon, light is rationed more strictly than food. Most cells have a single opening high in the wall, no larger than a loaf of bread, barred and sometimes covered with a wooden shutter. If you are lucky enough to be positioned beneath it, you might see a sliver of daylight for part of the morning or late afternoon. If you are unlucky, you will only know the time has changed, because the quality of the darkness shifts from deep black to a thin, smoky grey. The medieval builders of these places did not intend for prisoners to enjoy the view. Windows were rare in underground chambers because every opening was a vulnerability. Light could only enter through narrow shafts or grates, often built at an angle so no one could see in or out clearly. This meant that the air was stale, the damp constant, and the shadows permanent. Candles were possible, but they were not given freely. In some prisons, you could rent one from the jailer for an amount that might equal a week's worth of food. Even then, the candle would be stubby and burn quickly, barely enough to see the walls before plunging you back into blackness. Oil lamps were similarly restricted. Guards feared they could be used to start fires, and oil was expensive. The flicker of a lamp in the corridor might be the only moving light you see for days. The human body and mind are not built for this. Without light cues, your sense of time begins to drift. What feels like a night's sleep might be only a few hours. What feels like a single afternoon could stretch into an entire day. Medieval accounts mention prisoners who slept for most of their confinement, not from laziness, but because their bodies had no reason to wake. Others stayed awake through long stretches, unable to sleep without the natural signal of darkness following light. This distortion of time can be as punishing as hunger or cold. You begin to lose track of how long you've been here, how much longer you might remain. The rhythm of the outside world becomes meaningless. The bells of the nearby church might faintly reach you if the wind is right, but without seeing the sun, they sound like random interruptions rather than markers of hours. Light also means safety here. In the darkness, you cannot see the rats until they are on you. You cannot spot the cockroach that just crawled into your gruel. You cannot check the condition of your chains or see the sores developing under the iron. The faintest glow from a distant torch can feel like protection, even if it is only for a few minutes. When it goes out, the darkness seems thicker than before. The absence of light changes how you perceive space. You begin to map your cell by touch, counting steps from one wall to another, feeling the rough patches of stone where water seeps in, memorizing the dips in the floor. You know where to place your feet so you do not stumble in the dark. This skill is practical, but it also reinforces your captivity. You become so familiar with the dimensions of your prison that it feels like the only space you can navigate. Medieval jailers understood the psychological effect of darkness even if they could not explain it scientifically. Darkness stripped away the outside world, leaving only the here and now. It made prisoners more dependent on the few moments when light was offered. A visit from a torch-carrying guard, even one who was bringing bad news, could feel like a blessing simply because it came with shadows that moved differently. And yet, the darkness has one more trick. It is the perfect backdrop for the sounds of the dungeon. Without sight, every noise feels closer. You hear the breathing of the person chained next to you, the shuffle of a rat somewhere near your foot, the steady drip of water into a puddle that you cannot see. Over time, your mind begins to fill the black space with shapes and figures that may or may not be there. When the rare beam of daylight does slip through, it is almost too much to bear. Your eyes sting, watering as if you have been looking into fire. The dust in the air becomes visible, swirling in slow patterns like tiny ghosts. You blink against the brightness, knowing it will be gone too soon. And when it is, the darkness rushes back in, heavier than before, reminding you that here in the dungeon, light is not your right. It is a privilege, and a fleeting one. But while the light is scarce and precious, there is one constant in the dungeon that is impossible to avoid. The soundscape of this place is its own form of captivity, a never-ending chorus that reminds you with every echo exactly where you are. The dungeon never falls completely silent. Even in the deepest hours of the night when the world above is still, something here is always making noise. Sound travels strangely in these spaces. The thick stone walls swallow some of it, but the rest bounces and bends until you cannot be sure where it came from. You might hear a clink of chain and swear it is next to you, only to realise it came from 3 cells away. Water is the most constant voice in this chorus. It drips from the ceiling in irregular patterns, sometimes a slow metronome, other times a maddening scatter of drops. In wetter months, trickles run down the walls into puddles, creating a faint gurgle that blends with the hollow echo of footsteps in the corridor. Medieval builders rarely lined these walls to stop leaks. In some places, the water was even welcomed as a crude drainage system, though it carried whatever filth it picked up along the way. Chains are the second most common sound, each one with its own pitch depending on the metal and the length. The shuffle of feet pulls them just enough to make them scrape or clank against the floor. Some prisoners fidget constantly, the sound becoming part of the background until it disappears from your conscious mind, only to jar you awake when it stops. Then there are the coughs, deep, rattling, wet coughs that linger for months in the same body. The air here encourages illness, and the noise of sick lungs is as much a part of the dungeon as the rats. Some coughs become markers of time. You learn to recognise them and know who is still alive because of them. When one stops for good, the silence in its place is deafening. Voices come and go. Sometimes they are muffled conversations between guards, echoing down the corridor. Sometimes they are shouts from another cell, sharp with anger or dull with desperation. There is no privacy here, so every argument, plea or moan becomes public property. Political prisoners, thieves and debtors all share the same air, their noises blending into a single restless hum. The torture chamber adds its own irregular punctuation, the creak of wood under strain, the metallic click of a screw tightening, the sharp intake of breath that travels farther than you would expect. Even when no one is inside, the mere sound of its heavy door opening can cause the entire dungeon to still for a moment. Rats contribute too. Their claws scratch across stone, their bodies rustle through straw, and sometimes you hear the faint squeals of a fight you cannot see. Cats, if they are allowed in, yowl in the darkness, their cries echoing like something much larger. Insects hum in warmer months, crawling in the corners where light and moisture meet. Footsteps of the guards are the most unpredictable. The heavy tread of boots on stone can mean a change in routine, a delivery of food, or a trip to somewhere worse. The sound grows louder, then pauses outside a cell. The rattle of a key follows, or the soft jingle of a belt hook. The door groans open, bringing with it the smell of the corridor. Then it closes, the footsteps fading until they vanish completely. Sound is not just a sensory detail here, it is a survival tool. You learn to tell the difference between the lazy rhythm of a bored guard's walk and the brisk pace of someone with intent. You know which squeak in the floor belongs to your cell door and which one belongs to the cell across from you. You can even sense the time of day, or what you think is the time, by the pattern of noises. The bells from above might mark hours, but down here it is the sequence of clinks, coughs and drips that tells you how long you've been awake. The echoes play tricks on your mind. In total darkness, a sound can seem to come from inside your own head. You imagine shapes in the blackness to match the noises you hear. A distant groan becomes a figure leaning against the wall. A faint tapping turns into someone creeping toward you. You know it is only your mind filling in gaps, but knowing does not make it stop. Over time, you adapt to the noise in the same way you adapt to the smell. It becomes part of the dungeon's identity, part of you. When there is silence, true silence, it feels wrong, like the air itself has gone still. That kind of silence is rare, and when it comes, it usually means something has happened. And in those moments, when the dungeon seems to be holding its breath, you become aware of the one force that shapes all of this, the people in charge of deciding who comes in, who leaves, and who never sees daylight again. They are not just guards. In the dungeon, the jailers are the architects of your existence. Every sound you hear, every scrap you eat, every shiver you endure passes through their control. In theory, they are here to keep order and prevent escapes. In practice, they are the gatekeepers of misery, deciding when to tighten it and when to loosen it, often for reasons known only to themselves. Medieval jailers rarely received a regular wage generous enough to make the job worthwhile. Many were paid partially or entirely through fees collected from the prisoners. This arrangement meant that survival often depended on how much you could pay them. Historical court records show that prisoners were charged for food, for bedding, for lighter chains, even for having the shackles unlocked in the morning. Those who could not pay were left to rot in the worst conditions available, a silent reminder that poverty was its own sentence. The jailer's power extends far beyond the official rules. They can withhold food, water, or access to the waste bucket. They can move you closer to the coldest wall, or farther from the one small opening that brings in light. They can swap you into a cell with a worse infestation of vermin. The official law does not require these adjustments, but the stone corridors carry countless stories of them happening. They are the link between the dungeon and the outside world. Letters, if they are allowed, pass through their hands first. A message from family can vanish without explanation, or be delayed until it no longer matters. Visitors, when they are permitted, are escorted under the jailer's watch, and the meeting might be cut short for the smallest imagined offence. Bribery is not subtle here. It is the most open of secrets. A few coins can secure cleaner straw, a corner farther from the waste bucket, or an extra ladle of gruel. Larger sums can buy privileges like a candle or a visit to the courtyard. In some cases, wealthier prisoners could pay to live in separate quarters entirely, their imprisonment little more than house arrest within the walls. Meanwhile, those without resources became the dungeon's fodder, stripped of comfort and dignity. Punishment is entirely at the jailer's discretion. There are official penalties for breaking rules, but in practice, any perceived slight, speaking too loudly, moving too slowly, making eye contact for too long, can earn you a tighter shackle, a harsher cell, or a night without food. Medieval chronicles mention jailers who had reputations as either merciless or unexpectedly lenient, but both types maintained the same control. Leniency was not kindness. It was strategy, a way to make loyalty or compliance worth something. Their knowledge of the dungeon is absolute. They know which prisoners are dangerous, which are desperate, and which are broken enough to be ignored. They can walk in darkness without stumbling, unlocking doors and navigating corridors by memory. They know which corners are damp enough to ruin a man's health in a week, and which ones offer a faint draught of fresher air. That knowledge is power, and it is never shared. The jailers also control your sense of time. Meals, if you can call them that, arrive when they choose. The footsteps of the guard bringing food might come after what feels like hours of waiting, or not at all. The same goes for water. There is no schedule posted, no warning given. Time here is measured in the intervals between the jailer's visits. Even the way they carry themselves has an effect. Some move silently, appearing without warning, their presence announced only by the sudden flare of a torch. Others make their approach deliberately loud, letting the clink of keys and the scrape of boots build tension before they appear. Both methods serve the same purpose, to remind you that they are in control. Not every jailer is cruel in the same way. Some relish the power openly, using every opportunity to display it. Others are indifferent, treating you as part of the furniture, an object to be managed. The rarest type is the one who shows a flicker of pity, but even that is dangerous to rely on. In a place where pity can be traded for coin or favour, it is never freely given. Their control shapes the dungeon's entire ecosystem. Without their permission, no food moves, no letters pass, no chains open, no prisoners leave. They can make the air feel heavier simply by standing in the doorway. They can decide that today you will eat, or today you will freeze, or today you will not see the small square of light at all. And when the jailer turns the key and walks away, the lock's click leaves you with the one reality you cannot bribe, charm, or endure your way out of. You are still here. And in this place, even the ground beneath you has its own way of grinding you down. It is easy to forget that the ground you live on is as much a part of your sentence as the chains and the walls. In the dungeon, the floor is not simply where you stand. It is where you sleep, where you eat, and where everything you want to forget eventually ends up. It is both your foundation and your constant reminder that comfort is a luxury you will not have here. Most dungeon floors were made from rough-hewn stone or packed earth. In older fortifications, the stone was uneven, worn smooth in some places by centuries of feet, jagged in others where time had split it. Packed earth might sound softer, but it quickly turned to mud in the damp, sucking at your feet and stealing any warmth from your body. In some cases, the mud never fully dried, becoming a permanent layer of slick filth. Straw was often scattered across the floor to make it more bearable, but this was not fresh, golden straw from a harvest. It was reused until it disintegrated, absorbing everything from spilled food to human waste. Prisoners walked over it, slept on it, coughed blood into it, and in time it became less bedding and more compost. When it was finally replaced, the new straw was often just as infested with fleas and lice as the old. Drainage was rarely considered in the original construction. Water seeped through cracks in the walls and pooled in the lowest spots, sometimes forming shallow, stagnant puddles. In coastal castles, salt water could force its way in during storms, leaving a crust that stung your skin when you knelt on it. In river-fed fortresses, the floor could flood during heavy rains, turning your cell into a shallow pond. The floor was also the final resting place for anything dropped, spilled, or discarded. Bones from meals, mouldy bread crusts, and the occasional dead rat all ended up underfoot. Without regular cleaning, these remains were trampled into the stone or earth, where they rotted in place. The smell rose from the ground itself, an earthy rot that mixed with the stench of waste and mildew. Sleeping on this surface was its own kind of punishment. Even with straw, the ground was unyielding. The cold from the stone seeped into your bones, and if you slept directly on it, you would wake with joints so stiff it hurt to move. In winter, the chill could be unbearable. In summer, the heat from crowded bodies and lack of ventilation turned the floor into a damp, sticky mat. Some prisoners tried to claim the higher, drier spots in the cell, often near a wall where the ground sloped slightly upward. These coveted spaces were usually held by those strong enough to defend them or rich enough to bribe the jailer for the privilege. Others were left to sleep in the dampest patches, where leaks from above dripped onto their backs, and vermin thrived in the moisture. Historical records describe prisoners using whatever they could find to create barriers between themselves and the ground. Bundles of rags, strips of leather, or even piles of bones were arranged into crude sleeping platforms. Guards sometimes dismantled these efforts, either to maintain control or because they considered them contraband. Anything that made life more bearable was subject to removal. The floor was also a tool of discipline. Being forced to kneel for hours on bare stone was a common form of punishment, sometimes with added weights tied to your body. The jagged edges of certain stones could cut into skin, leaving wounds that festered in the damp. In some prisons, cells were deliberately left with loose gravel or rubble scattered across the floor to make lying down painful. And then there was the waste. In many dungeons, the floor simply absorbed what the prisoners produced. Buckets overflowed, slops were thrown carelessly. Over time, layers of grime built up, so that even if the cell was scrubbed, which was rare, the ground never truly came clean. In places without proper ventilation, ammonia from urine hung low to the ground, stinging your eyes if you tried to sleep too close to it. You cannot escape it. No matter where you sit, stand, or lie, the floor is always there, pressing its reality into you. It does not change when the jailer leaves. It does not soften when you're sick. It does not care if you're here for a week or for the rest of your life. It is a constant, a reminder that in the dungeon, even the ground itself works against you. And just above that ground, within reach of your hand, is the other half of your confinement. The walls that hold in the cold, the damp, and every breath you take. They are the first thing you touch when you're thrown into the cell and the last thing you'll see if you never leave. The dungeon walls are more than boundaries. They are the silent witnesses to everything that happens here, and they keep their secrets better than any guard. You live pressed against them, leaning for rest, chained to them, tracing their surface in the dark as if the grooves might tell you a way out. Most are made of thick stone, quarried locally and chosen not for beauty but for strength. Granite, limestone and sandstone were common in medieval construction, each with its own texture. Granite is unyielding and cold, its surface rough enough to scrape your skin if you slide against it. Limestone holds moisture like a sponge, sweating in the heat and freezing hard in the cold. Sandstone crumbles under persistent contact, leaving grit in your hands. All of them share the same trait. They steal warmth from your body faster than the air does. Moisture is always present. The damp creeps down from cracks in the ceiling or up from the earth behind the wall. In some cells, water beads constantly on the surface, forming rivulets that trickle into small pools along the floor. Over time, these wet patches become breeding grounds for moss and fungi. You might feel the slimy surface beneath your fingertips, the smell of rot clinging to your skin afterward. Medieval builders did not seal these stones, so the walls became part of the dungeon's living ecosystem. The walls are never truly clean. Layers of grime build up from centuries of human contact. Grease from unwashed hands, soot from torches, stains from blood or waste, all of it seeps into the porous stone. In places where prisoners were chained directly to the wall, you can sometimes see the marks where the iron rubbed and scratched, carving deep grooves over years of movement. Archaeologists have found scratches, tally marks, and crude carvings left by those who came before, each one a small rebellion against being forgotten. Light behaves strangely here. In the rare moments when a candle or torch is lit, the walls catch the glow unevenly, highlighting every irregularity in the surface. Shadows pool in the cracks, stretching and shrinking with the flicker of the flame. Without light, the walls seem to close in. You feel their presence even when you cannot see them, the cold pressing in from all sides. The walls also shape the dungeon's sound. Their hard surfaces bounce noises back into the room, distorting them. A cough in the corner sounds like it's coming from behind you. A footstep in the corridor might seem just outside your cell. This echo effect was sometimes deliberate. Certain chambers were designed to amplify sound, making the cries from the torture room travel farther. For the jailer, the walls are tools of control. Chains are anchored directly into them, either with iron rings set in mortar or with holes drilled deep into the stone. A prisoner chained in this way is kept within arm's reach of the wall at all times. Some cells were built with sloping walls, subtly narrowing toward the ceiling to create a sensation of being trapped in a funnel. Others had niches where guards could place torches to watch you without stepping inside. The walls can hurt you in ways you do not expect. Leaning against them for too long can chill you to the bone. Rubbing against them when you are shackled can wear the skin off your wrists or ankles. In damp conditions, the rough edges can cause small cuts that quickly become infected. If you're chained upright, your head might rest against the wall for hours, the cold seeping directly into your skull. And yet, you find yourself touching them constantly. In the darkness, your hands search for familiar edges and cracks. You learn where the stone is smoother from centuries of use, where a corner juts out enough to rest your head, where the mortar crumbles if you press it. These details become a map not to escape, that is almost always impossible, but to anchor your mind in a place where time is meaningless. The walls keep their history. Every prisoner who came before you left something behind, a scrape from a chain, a worn patch where a shoulder leaned, a faint discoloration where a torch once burned too close. They are archives written in stone, but you have no way to read them fully. You only know that you're now part of them, your presence adding another layer to their record. And above your head, running across these same walls, are the bars and grates that pretend to offer freedom, but in truth serve only to remind you how far away it is. They look like a promise, a square of open space, a glimpse of something beyond the cell, maybe sky, maybe only another wall. The bars and grates are the dungeon's cruelest ornament. They let in just enough light or air to remind you of what you do not have, but never enough to make a difference. Most medieval dungeon bars were made of wrought iron, hammered by blacksmiths into thick rods that could withstand both time and human desperation. They were often set deep into the stone, wedged in place with lead or mortar, so there was no chance of prying them loose with bare hands. The spacing between them was deliberate, narrow enough to prevent a body from passing through, wide enough to taunt you with the idea that you might slip a hand into the world beyond. Grates were even more limiting. Some were flat plates of iron pierced with small openings. Others were a lattice of crossed bars, reinforced so that even if one was sawed through, the rest would hold. These were often mounted at an angle, making it difficult to see straight out. A design choice that ensured you could hear the life outside but only catch glimpses of it. In most cells, the barred openings were placed high on the wall, well above eye level. This was not an accident. It forced you to stretch or climb to see out, a reminder that the outside world was literally above you. In some cases, the opening was set in a narrow shaft that extended several feet through the wall, so even when you looked up, you saw more stone than sky. The shaft funneled sound down into the cell. Footsteps, voices, the clang of a distant gate, without letting you see their source. Air moved reluctantly through these openings. In the best conditions, you might feel a faint draft on your face if you stood in exactly the right spot. In the worst, the grate admitted nothing but the smell of the world outside. Smoke from a cooking fire, the rank odour of a nearby moat, or the faint perfume of a passing market you would never visit. Historical accounts describe prisoners weeping at the smell of bread or roasting meat drifting in through a window, a reminder of a life they could not return to. Bars and grates also served the jailers. They were vantage points, allowing guards to look into the cell without stepping inside. In some dungeons, small holes or slits were cut near the base of the wall for the same purpose, so a guard could crouch and observe you while remaining hidden. It was surveillance without warning, a quiet pressure that made privacy impossible. Attempts to tamper with the bars were met with swift punishment. Iron was inspected regularly for signs of filing or bending. Prisoners caught trying to work the metal loose were often moved to cells with even smaller openings, or worse, to a chamber with no opening at all. Yet desperate people tried anyway. Chroniclers tell of prisoners who spent months scraping at the lead joints with stolen nails or sharpened bones, only to be discovered before the final bar gave way. Even untouched, the bars marked you. In some cells, the high opening cast shadows across the floor in the shape of prison bars, a visual cage within a physical one. In rare moments of sunlight, those shadows moved slowly across the stone, the closest thing to a clock you had. When the light faded, the darkness returned instantly, as if the window had never been there. Grates were not always permanent fixtures. In temporary holding cells, they could be removed to admit larger objects or to drag a prisoner out. The sound of a grate being lifted from its frame was unmistakable, a grinding metal shriek that meant change was coming, though not necessarily for the better. The illusion they offered was the cruelest part. A barred opening lets you believe in fresh air, in open space, in the possibility of escape. But every design choice, the height, the angle, the thickness, exists to make sure you never reach it. You can stare at it until your eyes burn, press your face against the cold iron until your skin aches, and still be no closer to the freedom it represents. And even if you could reach through, the world outside the bars is not always a rescue. Many dungeon openings faced courtyards where executions were held, so the view through the bars could just as easily be a public display of punishment. Seeing daylight meant nothing if it came with the sound of the scaffold being prepared. The bars and grates are your reminder that the dungeon is not just a place of confinement, it is a place of design, every element carefully chosen to keep you here in body and in mind. And just as the openings control what you can see, the guards control what you can eat, and the food they provide or withhold carries its own brand of cruelty. If the dungeon is a machine built to grind you down, the food is one of its most efficient gears. It is not designed to nourish, only to prolong existence just enough to keep you here. Every bite reminds you that survival is possible, but comfort is not. The mainstay in many medieval prisons was prison bread, a dark, dense loaf made from the cheapest grain available, often rye or barley. Wheat was far too valuable for prisoners. The flour was rarely sifted, so bits of husk and grit remained, grinding between your teeth as you chewed. In hard times, it was bulked out with ground bean husks, pea flour, or even sawdust. That is not metaphor. Records from the 14th century mention sawdust mixed into flour to stretch supplies. It gave the bread a strange texture and could cut the mouth if baked poorly. Meat was a rarity, and when it appeared it was usually in the form of scraps too tough or rancid to sell elsewhere. Pork fat or gristle might be boiled into the daily gruel, the flavour more of salt and grease than of the animal itself. Gruel was the other staple, a thin, watery porridge made from oats, barley or millet. cooked in whatever liquid was available. In a good week, that liquid might be weak ale, which at least killed some bacteria. In a bad week, it was water from a barrel that had been standing so long it grew a green film. Fresh produce was nearly unheard of unless it came from scraps in the guard's kitchen. Some prisons relied on donations from local markets, which meant prisoners ate whatever was cheapest or most spoiled. Rotten cabbage leaves, turnips with soft spots, onions sprouting green shoots. These were added to the gruel for bulk. It was food in the strictest sense, enough to quiet the stomach for a while, but not enough to prevent malnutrition. Salt was precious and often absent. Without it, the food tasted flat, but worse, it failed to preserve what little meat or vegetables were available. Spoilage was common, and there are accounts of prisoners being served food crawling with maggots. Eating it was not optional. Refusing meant going hungry, and hunger could be more dangerous than a bad meal. The quantity was as much a punishment as the quality. Official prison regulations in some medieval towns specified daily rations as small as half a pound of bread and a pint of liquid. That was for an able-bodied adult expected to survive on it indefinitely. Many prisoners wasted away within weeks. Starvation did not need to be total to be effective. Weakness, dizziness, and muscle loss made escape impossible and compliance more likely. Food was also part of the dungeon's informal economy. A piece of bread could be traded for protection, a sip of ale for a moment of peace. The jailer controlled this entirely. Extra rations could be given as a reward for obedience or withheld for the smallest infraction. Wealthy prisoners could buy better meals, sometimes arranging for food to be brought from outside. Poorer ones relied on charity from fellow inmates or from religious visitors who occasionally distributed loaves as an act of piety. Eating in the dungeon was rarely done in solitude. Meals were dumped into a communal pot or ladled into whatever container you happened to have. If you had no bowl, you might cup your hands to drink the gruel, letting half of it spill onto the floor. Bread was broken and passed, not for camaraderie, but because one loaf between 6 people demanded it. Rats were never far away, darting in to snatch crumbs before you could. The act of eating was sometimes made deliberately unpleasant. Food might be delivered cold and congealed, or thrown onto the floor so you had to retrieve it from the filth. In some places, jailers rationed food by making prisoners line up and eat under supervision, the guards watching for hidden scraps that could be traded later. Malnutrition brought its own problems. Without enough protein or fresh vegetables, scurvy and other deficiency diseases were common. Teeth loosened, gums bled, and wounds healed slowly if at all. Skin grew pale and thin, hair fell out, and vision blurred in the low light. All of this made prisoners more susceptible to illness, which spread easily in the cramped, damp air. And yet, despite the misery of the food, it became one of the most anticipated parts of the day. Not for pleasure, but because it was one of the few events that marked the passing of time. The sound of footsteps approaching with a bucket of gruel or the sack of bread was a reminder that you had survived another stretch in the darkness. But the food was not the only thing that shaped your body here. The dungeon had other ways to weaken you, ways that worked slowly and relentlessly until you could barely stand. The chains you wore, and the toll they took on your flesh. They are the dungeon's constant touch. Cold when you wake, heavier when you try to move, always there even when you try to forget them. Chains are not just restraints here. They are part of the architecture of your captivity, an extension of the walls and floor, designed to limit every gesture, every step, and every moment of comfort. Most medieval prison chains were forged from wrought iron, hammered by blacksmiths into thick, uneven links. Each one was strong enough to bear the weight of a man pulling with all his strength, yet heavy enough to make even small movements feel like labour. They were rarely polished smooth. The surface was pitted from the forge and rusted from constant exposure to damp air. Every shift of your wrist or ankle, drags that rough surface against your skin. Shackles were often riveted directly around the limbs, custom fitted in the worst possible sense, not to match your size, but to ensure they could not be removed without tools. Too loose, and they rubbed constantly, wearing away skin until it bled. Too tight, and they cut into the flesh, swelling the limb and making movement painful. In some cases, the swelling became so severe that the iron had to be cut away to prevent gangrene. That was not an act of mercy. It was simply a way to keep you alive long enough to serve your sentence. Chains were fixed to different parts of the cell depending on your perceived threat. A floor anchor kept you in one place entirely, forcing you to eat, sleep, and relieve yourself without moving more than a few feet. Wall rings allowed slightly more range, but only in a semicircle defined by the length of the chain. Ceiling chains were reserved for short-term punishment, keeping your arms above your head so long that your shoulders ached for days afterward. The weight itself was part of the punishment. Even if the chain was short, its pull on your limbs was constant. Over time, your muscles adapted not with strength, but with fatigue. You learned to move in short, careful motions to avoid the jarring clank that sent vibrations up into your bones. Sleep brought no escape. The iron lay against you no matter which way you turned, pressing into skin already raw. Historical accounts from England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire all describe the use of additional weights. Some prisoners were given bilbos, heavy iron bars that linked both ankles together, which made walking nearly impossible. Others were fitted with collars attached to chains fixed to the wall, forcing them to sit or kneel in one position. Rust was a constant companion. In the damp of the dungeon, the iron never stayed dry. The reddish flakes stained your skin and clothing, and if you had an open wound, the rust mixed with dirt to form a paste that almost guaranteed infection. There were no oilings or cleanings unless the jailer wanted to keep the chain from breaking. Your comfort was irrelevant to its maintenance. Some chains were deliberately short enough to keep you from lying flat. You might spend days hunched over or curled on your side. This bent posture strained your back and cramped your legs until even standing felt unnatural. Prisoners who spent years like this often left with permanent deformities, their spines and joints shaped by the iron that held them. Noise was another weapon. Chains were never silent. Every movement made them clink or scrape, a sound that became part of your identity in the cell. Other prisoners learned to recognize you by it, just as you learned theirs. In the darkness, the sound of a chain tightening could mean someone was moving closer, or someone had been pulled back by their restraint. Bribery could sometimes buy a lighter set, a longer length, or a smoother finish. The wealthy might even pay for a padded lining of cloth or leather to reduce chafing. The poor had no such options. Their ankles and wrists bore the marks of the iron until they scarred over, only to split open again with the next movement. The chains didn't need to be pulled tight to control you. They didn't need to be jerked or rattled by the guard. Their mere presence was enough. They set the limits of your world and reminded you that those limits were not yours to choose. And as you shifted against the cold iron, you realized that every movement you made was a negotiation, not with your body, but with the metal itself. And if the chains defined your physical world, the company you kept within them defined the rest. In the dungeon, who you were locked in with could be the difference between survival and despair. You do not choose them. They are assigned to you by the jailer by chance, or by the simple fact that space in the dungeon is limited. The people you share the cell with become your entire society, whether you want them or not. In the darkness, you learn their breathing before you learn their faces. You come to know the sound of their chain, the rhythm of their cough, and the small noises they make when trying to get comfortable. Medieval dungeons rarely practiced solitary confinement for ordinary prisoners. It was expensive and required more space than most castles or town jails could spare. Instead, cells were communal pits, mixing criminals, debtors, political prisoners, and the unlucky souls who had crossed the wrong person at the wrong time. Historical records show that in many prisons, there was no separation by crime. Someone accused of petty theft could find themselves shackled next to an experienced mercenary or a man awaiting trial for treason. The first thing you notice is the smell of the others. Each person carries their own layer of dirt, sweat and sickness, and in a closed space those smells blend until you can no longer separate them. You also notice the sounds: muttered prayers, grinding teeth, the scrape of nails on skin during an endless itch. Communication is not always friendly. Hunger, cold, and fear shorten tempers, and small disputes over space or scraps of food can erupt into fights. Alliances form quickly. These may be based on shared background, shared enemies, or simply proximity. In some dungeons, prisoners organize themselves into loose hierarchies, with stronger or more connected inmates controlling access to the best sleeping spots, or the least foul corner of the cell. Protection could be bought with food, coin, or favours. Those who had nothing to trade often became invisible, ignored by everyone until they became ill or too weak to move. Not everyone in the cell is a threat, but everyone is a risk. Disease moves faster in close quarters, and one coughing inmate can spread sickness to everyone. The medieval understanding of contagion was limited, but prisoners knew enough to fear the symptoms. Some would avoid contact entirely, curling into themselves and speaking little. Others clung to any scrap of human contact, even if it meant sharing the same straw or cup. There is also the question of information. Inmates talk, and in talking they reveal things. Who has money hidden? Who might be ransomed? Who is likely to be released soon? This knowledge can be traded to the jailer or used to manipulate the prisoner it concerns. A careless word spoken in the dark can lead to punishment in the morning. Yet for all the danger, the other prisoners are also your only connection to something resembling human life. In the absence of sunlight and routine, conversation becomes a way to mark time. People tell stories, recite prayers, sing quietly, or list the names of their family members as if speaking them aloud will keep them real. Some scratch games into the wall, or pass the hours carving small shapes into bits of wood or bone. Wealth and status from the outside world sometimes survive inside, though altered. Nobles and wealthy merchants could buy privileges, more space, better food, lighter chains, and sometimes even paid other prisoners to serve them. This imbalance could cause tension, but it could also create opportunities for those willing to attach themselves to the powerful. A noble in need of a runner for messages might be willing to share a blanket in return. And then there are those who have given up entirely. You can hear it in the way they breathe, in their refusal to move even when a rat brushes past them. They no longer argue, no longer look toward the bars when light filters in. These prisoners have folded into the dungeon, becoming part of the scenery, as permanent as the walls. Living among others in such confinement forces you to sharpen certain instincts. You learn to sleep lightly, to recognize the sound of someone shifting closer, to keep one hand near whatever you own. You learn when to speak and when to stay silent. You learn that trust is rare and often temporary. And through it all, you realize that the cell itself is not the only cage. The company you keep is its own prison, shaping your days and nights as much as the chains on your ankles. And when the cell door opens, it is not always for release. Sometimes it is for the long walk up into a place far louder, far hotter, and far more final than the dungeon below. When the cell door opens for this, you know it is not for freedom. The sound of the key turning is slower, more deliberate, as if the jailer wants every click to sink in. Light, whatever the weather offers, spills into the cell, stabbing your eyes after so long in the dark. The chains are checked, tightened, or replaced with ones designed for walking. Then you're led upward, each step echoing against stone you've not touched in months. Public punishment is theatre in the medieval world. It is not just about the pain inflicted on you, but the message delivered to everyone watching. town squares, market days, churchyards, these are the chosen stages. The crowd gathers not out of compassion but for spectacle, the same way they would gather for a festival or a market stall selling something unusual. Depending on your crime, the punishment could be flogging, branding, the pillory, or any number of region-specific delights. Flogging was the most common, delivered with whips, rods, or knotted cords that tore skin as easily as cloth. Branding used heated irons pressed to flesh, leaving permanent marks that told the world what you had done. The pillory, a wooden frame that locked your head and hands in place, was less about physical damage and more about exposure. You were held there for hours while people shouted, spat, or threw whatever came to hand. In some towns, rotten vegetables were the traditional choice. In others, stones were common enough that the punishment often left more than bruises. These events were not always the result of a trial. In some jurisdictions, a jailer or local magistrate had the authority to order public punishment as a warning to others, especially for lesser crimes that did not warrant execution. For the authorities, it was cost-effective. No need to feed you in the dungeon for months if a few lashes and public shame would serve the same purpose. For the prisoner, the worst part was often the walk itself. Shackled, paraded through streets you once knew, you could see the contrast between your world and the one outside. Bakers setting out fresh loaves, children playing in alleyways, the smell of cooking meat from a tavern you will not enter. These details cut deeper than the punishment waiting ahead, because they remind you of the life now locked behind the cell door. The crowd's reaction varied. Some jeered loudly, enjoying the humiliation. Others watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. A few might look away, uncomfortable with the spectacle, but they were outnumbered by those who leaned in to get a better view. In many cases, neighbours, rivals, or even family members would attend, each with their own reasons for being there. Pain was part of the design, but so was exhaustion. You might be made to stand in the pillory all day, muscles aching from the fixed position. Floggings could be administered in sets, with pauses in between to let the crowd inspect the damage. Branding irons were sometimes displayed to the audience before use, held over a fire until they glowed. Every moment was calculated to keep attention fixed on you. Afterward, you were rarely given time to recover. If you were not released outright, you were marched back to the dungeon, wounds exposed to the cold air, dirt clinging to raw skin. Medical care was minimal unless the authorities still needed you alive. Infection was common, and many prisoners did not survive long after such punishments, not because the act itself was fatal, but because the dungeon was a perfect incubator for disease. These events also served as warnings to those still in the cells. The sounds carried, the shouts of the crowd, the sharp crack of a whip, the low groan of someone struggling to stand. Prisoners who had not yet faced such treatment could imagine it clearly enough, and that imagination was often more effective than the punishment itself. For you, the return to the dungeon is almost worse than the outing. The brief taste of open air lingers in your mind, making the cell seem smaller, the air heavier, the darkness deeper, and you know that the next time the door opens it may not be for punishment at all. It might be for the final walk out, the one that ends on the scaffold. When it comes, there is no mistaking it. The door opens earlier than usual, the footsteps are more numerous, and the air from the corridor feels colder. There is no food bucket, no chains for walking to the courtyard, no candle for inspection. Only the order to stand whether you can or not, and the heavy sound of additional shackles being fixed in place. Executions in the medieval world are not rushed affairs. They are public events, part punishment and part civic ritual. The authorities believe they serve as warnings, but they are also spectacles, the kind of thing people plan their day around. The scaffold is often built in a central square or on a hill outside the walls, somewhere with room for a crowd. Days before, carpenters assemble the structure in full view of the public, hammering each plank while onlookers speculate about who will be standing on it. The walk to that place is deliberate. You're paraded through the streets in chains, sometimes with a rope around your neck, sometimes barefoot so every stone and shard digs into your skin. Guards flank you on both sides, but their main task is not to keep you from escaping. It is to keep the crowd from reaching you before the execution. In some towns, people throw rotten food, dung, or sharp stones along the route. In others, they watch in silence, eyes fixed on you as you pass. If you've been sentenced to hanging, the gallows is a simple frame of timber with a beam overhead and a rope hanging ready. For beheading, a block or chopping post stands at the centre, often stained from earlier use. In certain parts of Europe, the wheel or the stake might be waiting instead. Each method carries its own ritual. Hangings sometimes involve a cart being pulled from under your feet. Beheadings require you to kneel, and the skill of the executioner determines whether it is swift or prolonged. The executioner is a figure of both fear and necessity. Well paid for each job, he may be masked or barefaced depending on local custom. His tools are kept in plain view, the axe sharpened to a fine edge, the rope coiled neatly, the firewood stacked if burning is the sentence. In many towns, the executioner is also responsible for maintaining these tools, a job that makes his presence known even when no one is scheduled to die. Religious officials are often present, urging confession and repentance. Some prisoners are allowed to speak before the sentence is carried out. These speeches can be brief, rambling, defiant, or filled with pleas for mercy that will not come. Chroniclers recorded them when they were memorable, especially if they included warnings to the crowd or criticism of those in power. But most vanish into the air, unheard beyond the first few rows of onlookers. The crowd's reaction varies with the crime. For notorious criminals, there may be cheering or jeering. For political prisoners or those seen as martyrs, there might be solemn silence, even mourning. Whatever the mood, the people watch closely. Executions are one of the few times when every rank of society gathers together. Peasants, merchants, clergy, and nobility, all drawn by the same grim spectacle. When the moment comes, there is little ceremony. The rope is tightened, the axe lifted, the torch touched to the kindling. The act itself takes seconds, but the build-up makes it feel like hours. If the execution is botched, as happened often enough, the crowd may gasp, murmur, or even shout for it to be finished. Few leave before the sentence is complete. For those who remain in the dungeon, news of an execution travels quickly. The returning guards carry the smell of smoke, or the faint iron tang of blood. Prisoners count the number of men who left and the number who came back, measuring their own chances against the silence of the missing. If you are the one taken, there is no return. The scaffold is not like the public punishment platform. There is no walking back down the steps. Once you leave the dungeon for the execution ground, the place you return to is the one where the walls are made of earth, and no one comes to check your chains. And yet, for every prisoner who meets that end, there are many more who are left behind, living out the slow erosion of body and mind. For them, the dungeon is not a place they pass through, but a place they become part of, until the outside world forgets they are even here. At first, you still expect something. A visit from a family member, a message from a friend, a sign that someone beyond the walls remembers you are here. In the beginning, you keep track of time as best you can, telling yourself that help will come when the right season arrives, or when the right person pleads your case. But seasons pass in darkness, and the voices calling for your release grow quieter until they vanish altogether. Being forgotten is not sudden. It happens in stages. Letters stop arriving, first sporadically, then not at all. The jailer, once willing to carry a message for a small fee, no longer bothers to stop by your cell except to deliver rations. The guards look at you less like a person and more like part of the furniture, an immovable fixture in the dungeon, no different from the chains or the straw. The medieval justice system was often slow and inconsistent. Trials could be postponed for months or years while officials argued over jurisdiction or waited for a travelling judge. In some cases, the prisoner was never formally convicted but remained locked away because no one took the responsibility to release them. Without records easily accessible, it was entirely possible to vanish into the paperwork of a castle jail or city prison, your existence reduced to a name on a crumbling roll of parchment that no one checked. Debtors were especially vulnerable to this fate. If those who owed you money refused to pay, or those you owed could not be found, your case might simply stall indefinitely. Political prisoners could be held until their captors changed power, and then forgotten entirely when new rulers saw no need to revisit old grudges. Life in this state changes in subtle ways. The idea of leaving begins to fade. You stop looking toward the bars when light appears. You stop asking guards for news. The concept of a future becomes abstract, something that belongs to other people. Instead, you live from one meagre meal to the next, one cough to the next, one drip of water to the next. The body changes too. Without hope of release, there is no urgency to keep yourself strong. You conserve energy constantly, moving only when necessary. Muscles waste away, and your frame grows smaller inside your loose clothing. The skin becomes pale, almost translucent from lack of sun. In the damp and cold, joints ache in ways that never fully ease, even in rest. Your world shrinks to the dimensions of your cell and the few people still inside it. Sometimes those people change as others are brought in or removed, but you remain. New prisoners might at first ask how long you have been here, but eventually they stop asking. To them, you are part of the dungeon itself, an unchanging feature of the room. In some dungeons, forgotten prisoners were moved to the least accessible corners, far from the main corridors, near walls that leaked more, or floors that flooded often. This kept them out of sight for visitors and reduced the need for guards to check on them regularly. It also meant that when illness came, it could run its course without interruption. Historical records mention cases of prisoners being rediscovered years later, skeletal but still alive, when new officials took charge of a prison and inspected the cells. Others were not found until after they died, their remains removed quietly without ceremony. The chroniclers often note these stories with a kind of detached amazement, as though the real marvel was not the cruelty of the system, but the fact that anyone had lasted that long. Being forgotten is its own kind of execution, slower and less visible than the scaffold, but just as final. The difference is that the dungeon keeps you alive enough to continue existing, even if that existence no longer belongs to you. Every breath, every blink, every heartbeat happens without the world knowing or caring. And sometimes, after years of this, the only change that comes is not freedom, but the arrival of the priest, the last visitor you will ever see. It begins quietly. The jailer's steps are slower than usual, and there is no food bucket in his hands. Instead, he carries a key ring and a glance that lingers just a little longer than normal. The priest follows, his robes brushing the damp floor, the faint smell of incense clashing with the dungeon's permanent stench. Even if you do not believe in what he represents, his presence tells you something important. You are leaving soon, and you are not coming back. In the medieval world, a priest's visit before death was standard practice. It was less about comfort for the prisoner, and more about fulfilling a social and religious duty. Confession was encouraged, repentance expected. In some towns, it was believed that dying unshriven could bring misfortune to the entire community. So the priest's work was as much for the living as it was for you. These final hours are strange. For years you have existed in routine. Chains, rations, darkness, the scrape of rats in the straw. Now everything happens with sudden purpose. Your shackles are unlocked not for cleaning or relocation, but for the last walk you will take. Sometimes you're given cleaner clothing, a symbolic gesture meant to show that justice is being served with dignity. In reality, it is also to make the spectacle more presentable for the crowd. The walk up from the dungeon feels different than any other. The air changes with each step, growing less stale, more alive with scents you had almost forgotten. The smell of earth after rain, the faint tang of wood smoke, the distant hint of baking bread from somewhere beyond the prison yard. Each one strikes you with an odd familiarity, like remembering a song you'd not heard in years. The guards do not speak much. Their job is to deliver you to the place of execution, not to reflect on it. Still, you can feel the subtle shift in their behaviour, the lack of petty jabs, the avoidance of unnecessary roughness. There is no point in punishment now. The dungeon has already done the bulk of the work. In some cases, there is a small crowd inside the prison yard, waiting to watch the final preparations. Executioners sharpen their blades or inspect the rope, making adjustments that seem ritualistic but are purely practical. The priest murmurs prayers, his voice steady even if yours is not. The jailer stands to one side, his keys hanging silent for the first time in years. The moment itself is brief, whatever the method. Hanging, beheading, burning, all end the same way. The crowd watches, the act is completed, and your part in the story ends. For you, there is no return to the dungeon. For those still inside, life continues as before, the cell door opening and closing on the same endless routine. What remains is the silence you leave behind, quickly filled by the drip of water, the shuffle of chains, and the next prisoner's breathing. The dungeon does not change because of your absence. It does not mourn, it does not remember. You are simply another body in its long history, and it will have more after you. And with that, the medieval dungeon closes its heavy iron door on you for the last time. So, if you've made it all the way through this cheerful bedtime tale of ankle sores, rat roommates, and food that could double as a building material, congratulations. You've survived longer than most actual medieval prisoners. You can now add endured an imaginary dungeon sentence to your life achievements, right between paid taxes on time and a something past its expiration date. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the least desirable Airbnb of the 14th century, go ahead and give the video a like. It really does help more than you'd think. And if you want to hear more relaxing journeys into history's weirdest corners, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next time we lock you in somewhere awful. Sleep well tonight, and be grateful your bedroom floor is not made of damp straw.